Notebook 4. Temptation in Genoa. Genoa, Saturday, 23 October 1666. I hesitated for a long time before I started writing again, but finally this morning I got myself a new bound notebook, and now, with some delectation, I am writing the very first page. But I am not sure I'll go on. I have already started 3 other notebooks, meaning to set down my plans, my wishes, my worries, my impressions of cities and men, a few touches of humor or wisdom, like so many travelers and chroniclers before me. But I haven't their talent, and my pages can't equal the ones I used to dust on my shelves. Still, I did my best to record everything that happened to me, even when prudence or pride might have kept me silent, even when I felt tired, except when I was ill or shut up somewhere. I've written something every evening, or almost. I've filled hundreds of pages in 3 different notebooks, but not one of them is left. I've written just for the flames. The first notebook, which told the beginning of my travels, was lost when I had to leave Constantinople in haste. The second was left behind when I was deported from Chios. The third probably got burned in the great fire of London, and yet here I am, smoothing the pages of the fourth, a mortal oblivious of death. A pitiful Sisyphus forever pushing a rock to the top of a hill only for it to fall down again. When in my shop in Giblet I had to throw the occasional decrepit old tome in the fire, I could never help sparing an affectionate thought for the poor fellow who wrote it. Sometimes it was only book he'd written in his whole life, his whole sole hope of leaving some trace of his passage. But his flame would turn into smoke just as his body would turn into dust. I am describing the death of a stranger, but I am really talking about myself. Death, my own death. What can it matter? What can books matter, or fame, if the whole world is about to go up in flames, like London? My mind's so confused this morning, but I must write. My pen must get up and move over the paper in spite of everything. Whether this notebook survives or burns, I shall write. I shall go on writing. First, how I got away from the inferno in London. When the fire broke out, I had to hide to escape the fury of the mob. They wanted to cut the papists' throats, with no other proof of guilt than the fact that I was a foreigner and from the same country as the Antichrist. Ordinary citizens would have seized, manhandled, and tortured me, and then thrown my remains into the flames, feeling that they'd advanced the good of their souls. But I have already spoken of this madness in the notebook that was lost, and I haven't the strength to go over it again. What I do want to say something more about is my fears. Fears, rather, for I have had 2 fears and then one more. I was afraid of the raging flames and of the raging mob, but also of what this whole sinister episode might mean, happening as it did on the very day the Muscovites had indicated as that of the apocalypse. I don't want to speculate any more about signs, but how can one fail to be terrified by such a coincidence? All day long on that accursed 11th of September, the 1st of September according to the English calendar, I mulled over that wretched prophecy. I discussed it at length with the chaplain. I don't say we were expecting the world to explode from one minute to the next in the vast commotion announced in the scriptures, but we were on the alert. And it was towards midnight at the end of that very day that fateful clamor burst out. I could watch the progress of the flames and hear the cries of the people from my bedroom. I had one comfort in my woe, in the devotion of the people around me. They'd become a family to me, whereas 3 weeks earlier they didn't even know I existed, any more than I knew they did. Bess, the chaplain, and his young disciples. Let no one think my gratitude to Bess was just that of a lonely man who found consolation in the naked arms of a sympathetic innkeeper. What her presence satisfied in me was not the carnal hunger of a traveler, it was my original fundamental distress. I was born a foreigner. I had lived as a foreigner, and I shall die more of a foreigner still. I am too proud to talk of hostility, humiliation, resentment, suffering, but I know how to recognize looks and gestures. Some women's arms are places of exile, others are a native land. After having hidden, protected, fed, and reassured me on the third day of the fire, Bess came and told me we must try to make a getaway. The fire was getting inexorably nearer, which meant that the mob was getting farther away. We could attempt to make our way between the two, aiming at a London bridge. There we'd board the first boat available to take us away from the conflagration. Bess said the chaplain approved of this course of action, though he himself preferred to stay on a while longer in the alehouse. If it escaped the flames, he could protect it from looters. His two disciples would stay on with him to keep watch and to help him if, after all, he had to flee. When the time came to leave, I wasn't thinking only of saving my life. I was also concerned about the 100th name. The book had been on my mind during all those days and nights, and the clearer it became that my stay in London was approaching its end, the more I wondered if I'd be able to persuade the chaplain to let me keep the 100th name with me. I even thought of taking it against his will. Yes, of stealing it. I'd never been capable of such a thing in other circumstances during an ordinary year. In any case, I am not sure I'd have gone through with such a despicable thing. Fortunately, I didn't have to. I didn't even have to use arguments I'd prepared. When I knocked at the door of his room to make my leave, the old man asked me to wait for a moment before asking me in. I found him sitting in his usual place, holding the book out towards me with both hands like a kind of offering. The gesture left both of us silent and motionless. Then he said in Latin with some solemnity, "Take it. It's yours. You have deserved it. I promised it to you in return for your undertaking to translate, and I know quite a lot now about what it says. Without you, I shan't be able to find out any more. Anyway, it's too late." I was moved. I thanked him and embraced him. Then we promised each other, without much conviction, that we'd meet again, if not in this world, then in the next. "That'll be very soon as far as I'm concerned," he said. "As far as all of us are concerned," I answered, indicating all that was going on around us. We'd have embarked on yet another discussion about the fate of the world if Bess hadn't begged me to hurry. She wanted us to set out at once. Just before we left the house, she turned round one last time to check up on whether I'd passed muster as an Englishman. She made me promise never to open my mouth, never to look people straight in the eye, but just to look sad and exhausted. It was a quarter of an hour's walk as the crow flies from the alehouse to the river, but we had to take a roundabout route to avoid the fire. Bess sensibly opted for skirting the whole of the area affected. She even started off along an alley on our left that seemed to lead in the opposite direction. I didn't argue. Then came another alley and a third, and perhaps 15 or 20 others. I didn't count. I didn't even try to make out where we were. It was all I could do to avoid falling into holes, walking into debris, and stepping into dirt. I followed Bess's mop of red hair as a soldier on the battlefield follows a plume or a standard. I trusted her with my life as a child puts its hands on its mother's, and I had no reason to regret it. We had only one scare, emerging into a little square at a place called Houndsditch. Near the city wall, we came on a crowd of about 60 people manhandling someone. Not wanting to show we were running away, Bess went up and asked a young woman what was going on. She was told that another fire had just broken out in the neighborhood, and the foreigner under attack, a Frenchman, had been found lurking nearby. I wished I could say I intervened to stop the mob from doing their worst, or at least that I tried, but Bess prevented me. The sad truth is that I walked on as fast as I could, only too glad to escape notice and not be in the victim's shoes as easily as I might have been. I didn't even look at the crowd lest our eyes meet, and as soon as my lady friend had, without undue haste, turned into a nearly empty alley, I followed her. Smoke was rising from a half-timbered house. Strangely enough, it was the top story that was being licked by tongues of flame. But Bess walked on, neither turning back nor hurrying forward, and I did the same. On the whole, if I had the choice, I preferred to die in the fire rather than at the hands of the mob. We completed the rest of our journey more or less without incident. We were almost choking on the acrid smell. The sky was veiled in smoke, and we were both stiff and short of breath, but Bess had chosen the safest route. We reached the Thames beyond the Tower of London, then turned back to the nearby landing stage by Iron Gate stairs. About 40 other people were waiting there, some of them women in tears. They were surrounded with piles of chests, bundles large and small, and pieces of furniture. You wondered how they could have got them there. Bess and I must have been traveling lighter than any of them. All I had with me was a canvas bag Bess had lent me. We must have looked very poor, but less unfortunate than the rest. All of them had obviously neither lost their houses already or expected to, like most of the city's inhabitants. But in my meager baggage I had the book for which I traveled across half the world, and I was leaving the great disaster unscathed. At the sight of all the melancholy faces surrounding us, we resigned ourselves to a long wait, but a boat arrived after a few minutes and moored nearby. It was half full of Londoners fleeing the city. The rest of the space was taken up with piles of casks. There were few places left for passengers, but two strapping fellows barred the way on board, tall, bearded, brawny-armed rascals with wet scarves wound round their heads. "A guinea each, man, woman, or child," one of them shouted forbiddingly. "Paid on the nail. No money, no room." I signed to Bess, and she said curtly, "All right, we'll pay." The man held out a hand. I took it and jumped into the boat, which was placed at an angle so that only one person could board at once. But when I turned and stretched out a hand to help Bess jump too, she just touched my fingers and then drew back, shaking her head. "Come on," I urged. She shook her head again and waved a hand in farewell. There was a sad smile on her face, but also, I think, a trace of regret or uncertainty. Someone pulled me back by my shirt so that others could get on to the boat. Then one of the sailors came to claim the fare. I got 2 guineas out of my purse, but gave him only 1. I still feel a pang as I write about it. Our farewells were too hasty, too sketchy. I ought to have talked to Bess before the boat arrived and found out what she really wanted. I behaved all the time as if it was understood that she'd come with me, even if it was only for a part of the way. But I ought to have seen that she wouldn't be coming with me, that there was no reason why she should leave her tavern and friends to come with me. Anyway, I never asked her to, never even thought of doing so. So why do I always have a sense of guilt whenever I mention her or London? Probably because I left her as I might have left a stranger, while in just a few days she gave me what people much closer to me will never give me in a lifetime. Because I owe her a debt that I can never repay. Because I escaped the inferno of London and she returned to it without making sufficient effort to stop her. Because I left her there on the quay without a word of thanks or a sign of affection. Because it seemed to me that at last moment she was hesitating, and a firm word from me might have made her jump into the boat. And there are other reasons too. I am sure she doesn't blame me, but it will be a long time before I stop blaming myself. I can hear Gregorio's voice. He's just back from the harbor. I must go and sit with him and have something to eat. I'll write some more this afternoon while he's having his siesta. Over our meal, my host talked to me about various matters concerning both our futures. He's still trying to persuade me to stay in Genoa. Sometimes I beg him to desist, and sometimes I give him some hope. The fact is, I don't know my own mind. I have a feeling that it's late. Time is getting short on the battlefield, and he's asking me to stop rushing about, to settle down and take my place beside him like a son. It's a great temptation, but I have other temptations, as well as other obligations, other matters of urgency. I already blame myself for having left the best in too cavalier a manner. How would I feel if I just abandoned Martha to her fate? Martha, who's carrying my child and who wouldn't be a prisoner today if I'd looked after her better. I want to spend what little time is left to me wiping out my debts and putting right my mistakes. And Gregorio wants me to forget the past, forget my home and my sister's sons and my former loves, and start a new life in Genoa. We are now in the last few weeks of the fateful year. Is this the right moment to begin a new life? All these questions have exhausted me. I must dismiss them from my mind and get on with my story. I'd got to where I was on the boat, leaving London. The passengers were muttering that the rogues who were conveying us would end on the gallows. The sailors themselves were singing and laughing, delighted with their spoils. They must have made more money in the last few days than they usually made in a year, and must be praying for God to stoke up the fire indefinitely. Not content with having extorted all those guineas for the fare, they made haste to land again as soon as we were out of the city, and then drove us off the boat like a herd of cattle. We hadn't been on board for more than about 20 minutes. They told anyone who protested that they'd save our lives by taking us away from the fire. We ought to thank them on our bended knees instead of complaining about how much they'd charged. I didn't protest. I was afraid my accent might give me away. And while our benefactors made their way back to London to collect more guineas, and most of my companions in misfortune, after a moment's hesitation, set off together for the nearest village, I decided to wait for another boat to come along. One other person did the same, a tall, fair, sturdy fellow who didn't speak and avoided catching my eye. I hadn't paid much attention to him among the crowd, but now we were alone, it was going to be difficult to ignore each other. I don't know how long we stood there, not saying anything, exchanging covert glances and pretending to look for something in our bags or a boat on the horizon. Suddenly, seeing the funny side of the situation, I went over to him and said with a broad smile in the best English I could muster, as if the fire wasn't bad enough, we had to fall into the clutches of those vultures. At this he seemed inordinately pleased, and approached with open arms. "So you are from abroad too," he cried, as if the fact that we were both foreigners made us compatriots. His English was less rudimentary than mine, but as soon as I told him where I was from, he courteously switched to Italian, or what he thought was Italian. For my ears it was incomprehensible. After I'd asked him 3 times to repeat the same sentence, he said it in Latin. That was relief to both of us. I soon found out quite a lot about him. He was a Bavarian, 5 years my senior, and since he was 19 and had lived in various foreign cities, Saragossa, Moscow for 3 years, Constantinople, Gutenberg, Paris, Amsterdam for 3.5 years, then London for the last 9 months. "My house burned down yesterday and I lost everything," he said. "All I have left is in this bag." He'd spoken lightly, as if rather amused, and I wondered at the time whether he wasn't more affected by the disaster than he was prepared to admit. But from speaking to him at length later, I am sure he was acting quite naturally. Unlike me, he is a real traveler. For him, anything that ties him to a place, walls, furniture, family, eventually becomes unbearable, Anything that makes him move on, even if it's a bankruptcy, banishment, war, or fire, is welcome. This passion seized him when he was still a child, during the German wars. He described the atrocities that had been committed in them, whole congregations slaughtered in the churches, villages decimated by famine, entire villages set alight then razed to the ground, not to mention the hangings, the burnings at the stake, the beheadings. His father was a printer in Ratisbon. The bishop had commissioned him to print a missal containing a diatribe against Luther, and both his press and his house had been burned down. The family emerged unscathed, but the father was an obstinate man and decided to rebuild house and workshop alike, exactly as they had been before and on the same spot. This swallowed up all his remaining fortune, and as soon as the work was complete, both buildings were burned down again. This time the printer's wife and an infant daughter died in the flames. The son, my new companion, vowed then that he'd never build a house of his own, or encumber himself with a family, or become attached to any piece of land. He said he was called George Caminarius. I don't know his real name. He seems to have unlimited money at his disposal, but is neither prodigal nor parsimonious with it. He was always reticent with me about his income, and despite all my professional skill at sniffing out where money comes from, I was never able to make out whether his derives from a legacy, an annuity, or some lucrative business. If it's about the latter, it can't be very respectable. We had endless conversations during the next few days, and he didn't mention it once. But first I must get back to the account of my flight. After waiting for more than an hour, during which we waved our arms in vain at various passing boats, one did come alongside at last. There were only two men on board, and they said they would take us anywhere we liked so long as it wasn't Holland, and we paid generously. George said we'd like to go to Dover, and they suggested taking us even further, to Calais. They asked 4 guineas for the trip, 2 guineas each. In normal times, this would have been exorbitant, but seeing what we'd just had to pay for a journey 20 times shorter, we saw no reason to haggle. The crossing was completed without incident. We stopped twice to take on food and water before emerging from the Thames estuary and heading for the French coast, which we reached on Friday, 17 September. A swarm of urchins descended on us at Calais. They were surprised and contemptuous when they found we had no baggage for them to carry. In the harbour and in the streets, dozens of people came up and asked us if it was true that London had been burned down. They seemed astonished at the news, but not heartbroken. It was in Calais the same evening that, looking for my journal to write down some notes, I found that it was gone. Had I dropped it as I made my way across London, or had someone stolen it while I was on the boat? The deck was crowded and the sailors were dishonest rascals. Unless I'd left it in my room at the alehouse or up in the attic, but I seem to remember putting it away before I went to fetch the 100th name, and I still have that in my possession. Should I be glad that it's my worthless musings that have disappeared rather than the book that made me travel around the world? I expect so. I expect so. Anyhow, I am relieved not to have lost the florins I was given in Lisbon for Gregorio, and to have been able to give them back to him instead of increasing my debt to him. There! My pen has got back into its old habits and is stoutly beginning to keep a travel journal, just as if I'd never lost my 3 previous notebooks, and London hadn't burned down, and the fateful year wasn't advancing inexorably towards its fulfillment. What else can I do? My pen wields me as much as I wield it. I have to follow its path just as it follows mine. But how late it is! I've been writing like someone eating after a fast. It's time I left the table. 24 October. It's Sunday, and this morning I went to church at Santa Croce with Gregorio and his family as if I were the son in law he'd like me to be. On the way back, he took my arm and told me yet again that if I were to settle in Genoa, become the founder of a new dynasty of Embriachi that would put the fame of the Ispinolas, the Malaspinas, and the Fieschi in the shade. I don't despise Gregorio's generous dream, but I can't find it in my heart to share it. Brother Egidio, my host's cousin, was present at Mass. I had lunch with him in April and gave him letters for my family. I haven't had any replies yet, but it takes 3 or 4 months for a letter to get to Giblet and the same for an answer to get back. On the other hand, he told me that only yesterday he'd had some recent news by post from Constantinople which was very surprising and which he'd like to tell me about. Gregorio immediately invited him to come and bless our humble meal, which he did willingly and with an excellent appetite. He had the letter on him. It tells of things that happened 6 weeks ago, and I am still not sure I believe what it says. It was written by a friend of his, a monk belonging to the same order who is on a mission to Constantinople. According to the letter, the authorities there heard from a rabbi in Poland that Sabbatai was preparing to foment a revolt, so he'd be taken to the Sultan's palace in Adrianople, and told that if he didn't perform a miracle immediately, he'd be tortured and beheaded, unless he repudiated the faith of his fathers and embraced that of the Turks. The miracle Sabbatai was asked to perform. Brother Egidio read me several passages from the letter, consisted of standing naked and acting as a target for the best archers in the Sultan's bodyguard. If he emerged unscathed, it would prove that he really was an emissary from God. Sabbatai asked for time to think it over, which was refused. Then he said he'd been considering adopting the faith of the Muhammad for some time, and there could be no more suitable place for his conversion than the presence of the Sultan. No sooner had he said this than he had to remove his Jewish skullcap, and a servant bound his head in a white turban. His Jewish name was changed to Mehmet Effendi, and he was given the title of Kabji Baki Oturk, which means honorary guardian of the Sultan's gates, with the corresponding emoluments. But according to Brother Egidio and Gregorio agreed, Sabbatai's apostasy was only apparent, like that of the Jews in Spain, who are Christians on Sunday and Jews in secret on Saturday. I still doubt whether this story is true, but if it is, and if it had happened during the fire of London, how can it not yet be another disturbing sign? Until other rumors arise and either remove my doubts or confirm them, I'd better go on with the account of my journey, lest new events make me forget the old. George and I stayed only 2 days and 3 nights in our hotel in Calais, but that was enough to do us a lot of good. We had separate beds in a large room overlooking the promenade and with a splendid view of the sea. The mornings were windy, with a fine, persistent driving rain, but the afternoons were fine, and we could see the townspeople strolling about enjoying the sunshine, in families or groups of friends. George and I joined them, after buying clean clothes and new shoes at inordinate prices from a cheat near the harbor. I call him a cheat because he sells shoes, though he's not a shoemaker, and clothes, though he's not a tailor, and I have no doubt that he gets his wares from porters and sailors who steal them from travelers, sprinting away one trunk and pretending to mislay another. It sometimes happens that travelers find themselves buying back their own clothes. One day I was told about a Neapolitan who found himself in this situation and demanded his things back. The receivers cut his throat to prevent him going to the police, but that wasn't in Calais, and after all, in spite of the price we'd had to pay, we were glad to find some decent clothes so quickly. As we walked along the promenade talking of this and that, George called my attention to how the women about us tripped along holding the men's arms, laughing with them and sometimes resting their heads on their shoulders, and how men and women alike would kiss one another on the cheek when they met. Once, twice, 3 or 4 times running, sometimes almost on the mouth. This didn't shock me, but it did strike me as odd. You'd never see men and women talking to each other so freely or cuddling and kissing like that in Smyrna or in Constantinople, in London or Genoa. And my companion said he'd never seen anything like it in all his travels from Spain to Holland or from his native Bavaria to Poland and Muscovy. He didn't disapprove of it either, but he couldn't stop looking at it in astonishment. At dawn on Monday, the 20th of September, we took our places on the public coach from Calais to Paris. We'd probably have done better to hire a coach and a coachman of our own, as George wanted to do. It would have cost much more, but we could have driven faster, stopped at better inns, kept more convenient hours, and enjoyed more some civilized conversation whenever we felt like it. As it was, we were treated grudgingly, fed on leftovers except at Amiens, made to sleep in a damp and grimy bed, and woken up before daybreak. And there were 4 long days of it, being jolted up and down in something more like an ox cart than a coach. It had 2 banquets facing one another, each of which would have seated 2 people comfortably, but was forced to accommodate 3. If one passenger happened to be rather stout, you were all crammed together like sardines for the whole journey. There were 5 of us. 2 were reasonably comfortable, but the other 3 could scarcely breathe, especially as one of us was slender and the others were bursting with health. I myself have always been hale and hearty, and Bess's buttered beer had made me put on a few pounds. George is even more solid, though his height makes it less obvious. As for the 2 traveling companions who joined us last, not only were they fat, but they had other weighty defects. They were priests, and they argued loudly with each other all the time. If one was silent, it was only because the other had started up again. Their gabble filled the coach and seemed to use up all the air, so that George and I, who usually enjoyed chatting, did no more exchange than irritated glances and the occasional feeble whisper. The worst of it was not content with deafening us with their opinions. The 2 men of God kept taking us to witness, not actually to ask for our point of view, but as if taken for granted it was the same as theirs and didn't need to be expressed. That's the only way some people know how to talk. I've often met them in my shop and elsewhere. They jabber at you great length, inviting you to agree with them, and if you make some subtle reservation, they assume it only backs them up and carry on even more volubly. To make them register a contrary opinion, you have to be quite curt or even downright disagreeable. The favorite subject of our 2 holy men was the Huguenots. At first, I couldn't understand why they were arguing so heatedly, because they were agreeing with one another. Their theme was that the supporters of the Reformation had no place in the kingdom of France and should be driven out so that the country could once more enjoy peace and the favors of heaven. They were treated too kindly, they said, and France would live to regret it. They rejoiced in France's misfortunes, and before long the king would realize they were traitors. The tone was unvaryingly threatening. Luther, Calvin, Coligny, and Zwingli were compared to various kinds of noxious animals, snakes, scorpions, and vermin, that ought to be crushed. Every time one priest expressed an opinion, the other agreed and went on further. It was George who explained it all to me during one of our silent exchanges. He signed to me discreetly to look at our fifth companion. This unfortunate was gasping for breath. His gaunt cheeks were flushed, his brow gleamed with sweat, his knees were clenched together, and he never raised his eyes from the ground. He was one of the race the priests was anathematizing. What saddened me and disappointed me was that my Bavarian friend smiled from time to time at the cruel sarcasms raining down on the unfortunate Huguenot. We had an argument about it that first night. Nothing, said George, will ever make me stand up for the people who burned my home down twice and caused my mother's death. But he had nothing to do with it, I cried. Look at him. He's never hurt a fly. Probably not, and so I wouldn't do him any harm, but I wouldn't defend him either. And don't talk to me about religious freedom. I've lived in England long enough to know that I, a papist, as they call it, am not allowed any freedom or shown any respect for my religion. Every time I've been insulted, I've had to force myself to smile and go on as if nothing had happened, like a coward. And you, while you were there, didn't you always feel like hiding the fact that you were a papist? Didn't anyone ever insult your religion in your presence? He was right, and he swore he believed in freedom of worship even more than I did. But he said that in his view, freedom must be reciprocal, as if it were in the order of things for tolerance to be met with tolerance and persecution with persecution. The persecution continued during the second day of the journey, and the two priests even managed to make me take part in it, in spite of myself, when one of them asked me point blank if I didn't think our coach was meant to hold 4 travelers, not 6. I could only agree, glad the discussion was turning to something other than the quarrel between the Papists and the Huguenots. But the priest who'd spoken to me, encouraged by my answer, went on to elaborate on the fact that we'd be much more comfortable if there were 4 of us instead of 5. Some people are not needed in this country, he said, though they don't seem to realize it. He pretended to hesitate, then went on grinning. I said, in this country. God forgive me, but I meant in this coach. I hope I haven't offended my neighbor. On the 3rd day, the coachman stopped at a small town called Breteuil, and when he came and opened the door, the Huguenot stood up and made his excuses. What? Said the priests. You're not leaving us already? Aren't you going to Paris? Unfortunately not, muttered their victim, leaving the coach without looking at any of us. He stopped for a moment to collect his baggage, and from the back of the coach then called to the coachman that he could go now. It was already dusk, and the driver whipped up the horses so as to reach the Beauvois before dark. If I go into all this apparently irrelevant detail, it's because I must relate the epilogue to this pitiful journey. When we got to Beauvois, a great shout went up. Our 2 priests had just discovered that the baggage, which all belonged to them, had fallen off the coach along the road. The rope securing it had given way, and in the clatter of hoofs and harness, no one had noticed when it fell off. The priests wrung their hands and tried to get the coachman to go back and look for their things, but he wouldn't hear of it. On the 4th day, the coach was peaceful at last. The 2 talkers had no more to say against the Huguenot, though not for the first time. They had some reason. They didn't even try to accuse him of anything, probably so as not to have to admit that the heretic had had the last word. They spent the day without their breviaries in their hands, muttering prayers. Isn't that what they ought to have been doing all along?